The fluorescent lights of Seattle General hummed like cicadas trapped in glass, their white glow flattening everything beneath them into shades of institutional beige. Danielle Ross moved through the trauma unit with the kind of quiet that comes from having already seen the worst. Her scrubs were coffee-stained, her name badge clipped to a pocket that had been mended twice, her shoes soft-soled to muffle footsteps on tile. She was the kind of nurse doctors saw but didn't notice, efficient enough not to complain about, invisible enough not to remember. Dr. Ashford noticed her anyway, which was the problem. He watched her reach for sterile gauze on the top shelf, noted the way her left shoulder caught mid-lift. She paused, steadied herself against the cabinet with her right hand, a micro-expression of discomfort flickering across her face before her features smoothed again. Weakness, he thought. She favored that shoulder, compensated with her core, moved like someone managing old pain. He'd reviewed her credentials, a standard hire, civilian hospital background, emergency room experience from a regional medical center in Washington state. Nothing impressive. Nothing that warranted the quiet competence she displayed. What he didn't see was the way her eyes scanned the trauma bay the moment she entered it each morning, exit routes, supply locations, overhead fixtures that could collapse, which doors opened toward her and which opened away. What he didn't see was the muscle memory in her hands when she placed and for, the precision of someone who'd threaded catheters into patients who were moving, bleeding, dying. What he didn't see was the single dog tag on a broken chain hanging beneath her scrub top, cold against her sternum, a secret that weighed more than metal should. The hospital cafeteria smelled like industrial bleach and microwaved chicken. Danielle sat alone at a corner table, black coffee steaming in a chipped mug, staring through the window at the parking garage beyond. Rain had started falling around 6 a.m., and it was still falling at 10:36, steady and patient, the kind of rain that came to North Carolina in October and stayed until spring got tired of waiting. She didn't look up when Dr. Ashford walked in with a cluster of residents, their white coats crisp and coordinated, their laughter loud enough to echo off the cafeteria's low ceiling. He glanced in her direction, a flick of his eyes, dismissive as switching a light off. His residents followed his gaze, copied his expression. Within 30 seconds they had selected a table as far from her as the room's dimensions allowed. Danielle didn't appear to notice. Her coffee was black and bitter, the way it had tasted in a forward operating base in Kandahar, the way it had tasted when she was keeping a man alive in an IED blast zone, the way it still tasted now. The dog tag shifted against her collarbone. She pressed her hand briefly to her chest, a small private gesture, then returned to her coffee. By 2 p.m., the emergency department had transformed into the kind of controlled chaos that only large teaching hospitals achieved. A multi-car collision on I-40 had sent 4 patients to Seattle General, and the trauma bays were moving like synchronized machinery, nurses calling out vitals, doctors barking orders, the whole operation running on the kind of precision that came from practice. Danielle was in Bay 4 with Mrs. Patterson, a 73-year-old woman with crushing chest pain and a cardiac history that read like a medical textbook of things that could go wrong. Mrs. Patterson's daughter, Rebecca, stood at the bedside in clothes still damp from rain, her eyes locked on her mother's pale face with the specific terror of watching a parent deteriorate. The heart monitor beeped in its mechanical rhythm, each pulse a small reassurance that hadn't yet become a lie. Danielle had been with Mrs. Patterson for 9 minutes, had run the 12-lead EKG herself, had documented the subtle ST elevation that spoke of an anterior wall MI with clinical precision. Dr. Ashford entered like he was late for something more important. He didn't introduce himself to the daughter. He didn't acknowledge Mrs. Patterson beyond a cursory glance at her monitor. He moved to the bedside with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned, and he read the EKG with the speed of someone who had already decided what he wanted to do before looking at the evidence. "We're starting a drip of Digitalis," he announced, his voice layered with the tone of someone explaining the world to people too simple to understand it. "Get me 0.5 milligrams for now." Danielle looked up from where she was adjusting the oxygen delivery. Her hands remained steady, her expression open and professional, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle straightening of the spine, a fractional pause that lasted maybe half a second. "Doctor, Mrs. Patterson has a history of renal insufficiency," Danielle said quietly. Her voice was level, almost conversational, the kind of voice that didn't startle people or make them defensive. She was speaking to Ashford, but she was careful to keep her words in the space where the daughter could hear them too. Her creatinine was 2.2 on admission labs. Digitalis isn't indicated in renal compromise. It increases toxicity risk. The fluorescent light seemed to get brighter. Rebecca's eyes widened fractionally. She was a smart woman. Danielle could see that in how her shoulders tensed, how her hand tightened on her mother's bedframe. She was beginning to understand that the quiet nurse wasn't just following protocol. She was protecting her. Dr. Ashford's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he did not appreciate being educated by someone in scrubs. His residents had followed him into the bay, 3 of them, young and impressionable and already learning which way the wind blew in his presence, and they shifted their weight, suddenly uncomfortable with the configuration of the room. Her renal function is noted, Ashford said, his voice smooth as oil spreading across water. He didn't make eye contact with Danielle. Instead, he turned to the closest resident, a tall man with the posture of someone still figuring out how to wear authority. Get that drip started. Now. The dose is contraindicated, Danielle said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't angry. It was simply a statement of medical fact, delivered with the calm of someone who had said true things before and wasn't surprised when they weren't believed. She was still standing in the exact same position, her hands positioned exactly where they'd been, her expression unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted in how she occupied space. Mrs. Patterson could go into Digitalis toxicity within the hour. Arrhythmias. Cardiac arrest. Rebecca's grip on the bedframe became white-knuckled. Mrs. Patterson's eyes had closed, her body surrendering to the terror of knowing something was wrong but not being well enough to fight it. Ashford turned to face Danielle fully. His eyes were the kind of blue that looked cold in fluorescent light, the eyes of someone who had learned that confidence could substitute for knowledge and had never been corrected. He moved to her with the careful deliberation of someone about to perform for witnesses. When he spoke, his voice filled the room like he was conducting, and the residents and the daughter and Mrs. Patterson all became an audience. Major Ross, he said, and there was something vicious in the way he lingered on her name, something that suggested he knew exactly what that title meant and had already decided it didn't matter in his hospital. I understand you have some emergency room experience from a regional facility. That's admirable. Really? He smiled without showing teeth. But let me be clear about something. In my trauma unit, we follow evidence-based protocols established by cardiac surgeons, not nurses. Especially not nurses who think a little bedside manner qualifies them for clinical decision-making. The residents looked at their shoes. Rebecca looked at Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson kept her eyes closed. Stick to taking vitals, Ashford continued, and his voice had taken on the particular tone of a man enjoying an audience. Leave medicine to actual doctors. Get the drip started, now. The resident moved toward the 4 stand. Danielle didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry or tremble or question the authority in his words. What she did was something far more dangerous. She simply stood there, her hand steady, her eyes flat and unreactive, and watched him with a kind of patience that suggested she had already seen men like him break under far less pressure than a clipboard and a title. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the glance she gave Rebecca Patterson, quick, direct, certain, that said without words, I see you. I'm going to protect your mother regardless of what this man just said. And Rebecca, smart woman that she was, understood exactly what the quiet nurse was promising. Ashford noticed that glance. His jaw tightened further. Something flickered across his features, there and gone like a light switch flipping, not anger exactly, but something closer to fury wearing the mask of professional concern. He had just established hierarchy in front of witnesses. He had just demonstrated control. And somehow, impossibly, this unremarkable woman in coffee-stained scrubs with a slight limp and one dead shoulder had managed to suggest, without saying a single disrespectful word, that his authority was a costume and his decisions were questionable. He turned on his heel and left the bay with his residents following like ducklings behind their mother. Danielle waited exactly 8 seconds, listening to his footsteps fade toward the next crisis, before she moved quietly to the medication cart and verified the 4 fluids Mrs. Patterson was already receiving. The next words she spoke were careful and calm and addressed directly to Rebecca. "We're going to monitor her closely," Danielle said. "I'm calling interventional cardiology for an angiogram. Your mother's going to intensive care. I'm going to be watching her labs personally." "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, and her voice cracked on the word. Danielle simply nodded. She didn't say "you're welcome." She didn't accept gratitude for doing her job. She just adjusted the oxygen and made notes in the chart and existed in the room with the kind of stillness that felt like protection. The dog tag beneath her scrub shifted against her sternum. She didn't touch it this time. She didn't need to. The metal was warm now, warmed by her body heat, and it carried its own kind of weight, old promises, old commitments, old lives held together by steady hands and quiet determination. The fluorescent lights hummed their cicada song above them all, indifferent to hierarchy, indifferent to credentials, indifferent to the fact that the person saving Mrs. Patterson's life was the one the chief of surgery had just publicly dismissed. In the distance, thunder rolled across Raleigh like artillery, and the rain kept falling. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and regret. Danielle sat at the corner table with her lunch untouched, a container of chicken and rice that had gone cold an hour ago. Around her, the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless mechanical song. She didn't look up when the first nurse stood. Then the second. By the time she registered what was happening, 3 of them had exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who've already decided something together, and moved to the table by the window. Then 2 more. Within 90 seconds, the entire break room had reorganized itself around an invisible border. Danielle Ross sat alone in a room of 20 people. The whispers started soft. They always did. "Ashford calls her the clipboard warrior in staff meetings now," someone said, just loud enough. "Can you believe she thought she knew better than," another voice, "she doesn't understand her place." That's the problem. Some nurses think they're doctors. A third, cruel and certain, "My sister worked with her at Duke Medical." Same thing happened there. Drama, drama, drama. Danielle kept her eyes on her cold rice. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She understood the mechanics of exile. She'd watched it happen in FOBs in Kandahar when a soldier lost the unit's trust, the way the circle closed until there was no one left but the enemy staring back at you. One nurse, Lauren Chen, made eye contact for half a second. Lauren had laughed at her jokes 3 weeks ago. Had asked about her weekend. Now her jaw clenched and she looked away, the guilt written across her face like a confession. Danielle saw the moment Lauren chose safety over solidarity. It was quick. It was human. It hurt differently than she expected it to hurt. She stood, abandoned her lunch, and walked out. The rain had started again outside, Raleigh rain, warm and relentless, hammering against the ER bay windows with the rhythm of something alive. She didn't check her phone. She knew what would be waiting there. The next morning, Danielle arrived for her shift and made her way to the unit board where staff postings and announcements lived in a neat grid of laminated paper and thumbtacks. What she saw there stopped her in the middle of the corridor. Other staff members slowed as they passed. Some pretended not to see. One young resident actually slowed down to read it twice, his eyebrows climbing higher with each word. Performance Improvement Plan. Employee, Danielle Ross, RN. Effective, immediately. Citing violations, insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. Danielle stood reading it, her hand steady at her sides. The list was meticulous. It mentioned the Room 314 incident with Mrs. Patterson, characterized as unsolicited medical judgment rather than patient advocacy. It mentioned 2 other instances she barely remembered, a conversation with a resident about medication timing, a suggestion about a patient's positioning. Everything was technically possible. Everything was technically wrong if you squinted at it through Dr. Ashford's particular lens. The margin of the page included his signature, crisp and practiced, like the signature of someone who'd signed many official documents meant to hurt people. Reading about yourself. His voice came from over her shoulder, too close, carrying the scent of expensive aftershave and coffee. Dr. Ashford appeared in her peripheral vision, and she felt rather than saw the satisfied smirk playing at his lips. He was dressed for surgery, navy scrubs, a watch that cost more than her monthly rent, the bearing of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in any room he entered. "Some people," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd of staff members who suddenly found reasons to linger near the board, "need to learn that in a hospital, hierarchy exists for a reason. Lives depend on people knowing their limitations." He placed a hand on the board, just below his signature, as if he were unveiling his masterpiece. "It's nothing personal, Nurse Ross. It's simply about maintaining standards." She turned to face him fully. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Danielle felt something shift. Not breaking. Never breaking. But realigning. The way a weapon realigns when you finally stop pretending it's something else. "I've seen better men than you break under less pressure than a clipboard," she said quietly. Her voice was steady as a surgical laser. Not angry. Not emotional. Just fact. Just observation. Just the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that breaking looks like. Dr. Ashford's smirk wavered. For one crystal moment, something flickered across his face, a recognition, maybe, that he'd just been assessed by someone with a depth of experience he couldn't fathom. Then his jaw tightened and he straightened, the uncertainty vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He was still the chief of surgery. He still held the clipboard. He was still winning. "Stick to your shift, Nurse Ross," he said, turning away. "The board expects improvement." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The dog tag chain beneath her scrubs had shifted slightly when she turned, the broken link catching on the fabric in a way that felt like a heartbeat, something metal and real and impossible to ignore, pressed against her collarbone like a secret. What they didn't know was that the exile had already begun its work. What they didn't know was that Danielle Ross had spent 2 tours in Kandahar, had held a soldier's chest cavity closed with her bare hands while rounds kicked up dust around them, had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do was underestimate the quiet person in the room. What they didn't know was that the woman standing in front of that bulletin board had been decorated for her service in ways that would make their security clearances inadequate to even read the file. But Dr. Ashford was calculating his next moves, and those wouldn't require what they knew. They would only require access and opportunity. Within 48 hours, Danielle would be removed from the trauma rotation entirely. Within a week, her access badges would stop functioning for critical care areas. Within 2 weeks, she would receive official notice of a performance improvement plan that came with the unspoken message every experienced nurse understood: quit, or be destroyed slowly enough that they could document every failure along the way. The rain continued outside, hammering against the windows of Seattle General like applause from an audience that didn't yet understand what it was watching. Somewhere in the hospital, in offices she couldn't access and meetings she wasn't invited to, Dr. Ashford was making phone calls. Board member Rebecca Chen was taking notes. The machinery of institutional power was beginning to move against a nurse that no one, in that moment, understood was the most prepared person in the building to survive it. Danielle walked to the locker room and changed into her scrubs for the day's shift. She tied her shoes with the same precision she'd used to tie combat boots. She clipped her badge to her pocket, the badge that would stop working in different areas within hours, though she didn't know that yet. She looked in the mirror and saw the woman staring back, dark eyes, steadied jaw, the kind of composure that frightens people who mistake quiet for weakness. Then she went to work, the way soldiers do. The way you do when you've already decided you're not going anywhere. The next morning, she arrived to find her shift had changed. No more trauma rotation. Geriatric med-surg now. The furthest possible unit from the action. The charge nurse, an older woman named Patterson who'd worked at Seattle General for 32 years, met her with an apologetic grimace. Ashford submitted the request yesterday, Patterson said quietly, handing her a new assignment sheet. Something about patient safety concerns. It's already been approved by administration. Danielle didn't argue. Arguing would require explaining, and explaining would require language that would only sound like excuses. She took the sheet, read the new schedule, exclusively night shifts, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., skeleton crews, minimum oversight, and understood the geometry of her isolation perfectly. That was the moment the real nightmare began. The night shift schedule wasn't a reassignment. It was an exile printed on thermal paper and posted in the break room at 4:48 p.m. on a Thursday, visible to everyone but addressed to no one. Danielle read it once, then again, understanding the geometry of it perfectly. Geriatric medical surgical floor. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Skeleton crews on purpose, 2 nurses covering 34 beds, the kind of ratio that made mistakes inevitable and oversight impossible. Her badge would still swipe open the med-surg elevators. The critical care units, though, trauma bay, ICU, emergency department, those doors required a supervisor code Dr. Ashford had clearly flagged her out of the system for. She held the schedule at arm's length the way a bomb tech holds a wire before cutting it, not sure which color meant what, only certain that every snip was intentional. By Friday morning, Dr. Ashford had made his calls. The first one was to Edward Hayes, the hospital's board chairman, at 6:15 a.m., early enough that it felt urgent, late enough that it couldn't be returned until business hours. The second was to Dr. Gerald Bennett, the chief medical officer, at 7:42 a.m. Then to Patricia Mendez, the chief nursing officer, who texted back within 90 seconds, need to discuss some concerns. The fourth call went to Richard Clayton from Hospital Risk Management, the man whose job was to stop lawsuits before they started, the man whose job was to protect the institution first and its people second. By noon, the calls had accumulated like pressure in a closed system, and Danielle didn't know about any of them because Dr. Ashford had made sure no one told her. That was the elegance of it. The blade was already between her ribs before she knew the weapon existed. The phone calls themselves were surgical in their precision. Dr. Ashford didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His voice was the controlled tone of a man expressing reasonable concern, the inflection of someone reluctantly forced to report a dangerous problem. I'm hesitant to bring this forward, he told Hayes, but patient safety is paramount. He described the trauma bay incident as an authorized medical intervention as scope creep as a nurse who had clearly exceeded her training in a way that could have caused serious harm. He mentioned the chest seal, that improvised, life-saving chest seal, as evidence of reckless cowbuying that prioritized ego over protocol. He suggested that the hospital was vulnerable. That litigation was possible. That someone needed to step in before the liability grew teeth. What he didn't say was true, that the patient lived because of her. That standard protocol would have left a man drowning in his own blood while bureaucracy played out. That the 3 soldiers in the trauma bay had watched her hands work and understood immediately what they were seeing. None of that made it into the calls because none of that served his purpose, and Dr. Ashford was very, very good at serving his own purpose. Danielle worked her first night shift on Saturday and felt the absence like an amputee feels a phantom limb. The med-surg floor hummed with the beeping of patient monitors and the occasional call light, a different rhythm from trauma, slower, measured, the sound of chronic illness instead of crisis. She moved through the halls with the efficiency that had kept her alive in 3 combat tours, checking vitals, adjusting medications, sitting with an 83-year-old named Mrs. Chen who couldn't sleep and wanted to talk about the grandson she'd never meet. It was good work, necessary work, the kind of nursing that saved lives in a way the world never saw. But it was not critical care. It was not the place she could help when it mattered most. That was the point of it, to make her useful enough to stay, invisible enough to not threaten anyone, contained enough that she couldn't cause trouble. By Sunday, the investigation was already underway. The notification came via email at 11:03 a.m., sent to her personal account by hospital HR, marked confidential personnel matter star. She was being placed on paid administrative leave pending a formal review of alleged scope of practice violations occurring during the trauma response on the evening of the date. She was not to discuss the matter with colleagues. She was not to access hospital systems. She was not to present herself for duty until the investigation concluded. The email was written in the passive voice of institutional protection, the kind of language designed to sound neutral while systematically dismantling someone's livelihood. It was signed by Patricia Mendez, CNO, but Danielle understood who had written it. Patricia had simply held the pen. She sat in her apartment at 2:17 a.m., reading the email on her phone, and felt something inside her go very quiet. Not the quiet of surrender. The quiet that comes before a storm. The kind of quiet that had filled the checkpoint outside Kandahar before the IED detonated, the silence that meant the air was about to change forever. She had survived an explosion that took her shoulder apart and left her medically discharged with a Purple Heart and a pension check every month and a future she had to rebuild from rubble. She had survived whispers from colleagues and a hospital system that looked at her credentials and saw a problem instead of a solution. She had survived Dr. Ashford's escalating contempt. But this was different. This was institutional. This was the machinery of a system protecting itself by erasing the person who had exposed its weakness. She didn't cry. The trembling she felt wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the feeling of a compressed spring being wound tighter and tighter, waiting for the release that hadn't come yet. She pulled her dog tag from beneath her scrubs, the one that didn't belong to her, the one the colonel had pressed into her palm as the convoy whisked him away, and held it in her closed fist until the metal edge bit into her skin like a question mark. The next morning, Monday, the hospital sent a certified letter formally requesting her surrender of her access badges, her parking pass, and any hospital property in her possession. Professional and procedural, the letter said. Nothing personal. But everything about it was personal because everything about it was designed to be humiliating, the formal language, the public nature of it, the way it arrived in an envelope marked *urgent* like a bill she'd forgotten to pay. Dr. Ashford had won. He had moved her from the trauma unit, isolated her on night shifts, made his calls to people who controlled her future, and then triggered the final mechanism that would remove her entirely. By Tuesday afternoon, she was no longer a nurse at Seattle General. She was a suspended employee. A liability. A problem that had been solved. What he didn't know was that solving problems had been her specialty for the past 12 years. The call came at 11:53 p.m. Mass casualty. Military convoy accident on I-40, mile marker 287, multiple trauma inbound in 4 minutes. The night shift ER was skeleton crew, 2 nurses, 1 resident, 1 attending who happened to be Dr. Ashford finishing paperwork upstairs. The intercom crackled with controlled urgency, trauma alert ×4. ETA 3 minutes 50 seconds. Danielle was restocking the suture cart when she heard it. Her hands didn't pause. Muscle memory operated independently, she was already moving before her conscious mind caught up, pulling level 1 trauma packs, checking blood product availability, setting up 2 bays with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this in places where the electricity came from generators and the surgical light was a helmet-mounted lamp. The other night nurse, Marcus, was pale. For at once? We're not staffed for, we're staffed for what we have, Danielle said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. Dr. Ashford appeared in the ER entrance like a man who'd swallowed his own importance. He'd been called from upstairs, and his white coat was pristine, his hair still holding the shape of afternoon product. He assessed the scene, the prepared bays, Danielle's controlled movements, Marcus pulling another crash cart, and something flickered across his face. Recognition that she'd done the work before he'd even arrived. He didn't acknowledge it. I'll take lead on triage, he announced to no one in particular. Danielle continued her preparations without looking at him. The first ambulance was audible before she finished speaking, the siren wailing like an animal calling across the city, getting closer, louder, then cutting to silence as the bay doors burst open. For patients. 2 walking. 1 with a femur fracture. 1 with a sucking chest wound. The 4th patient, the John Doe with the penetrating thoracic trauma, went straight to Danielle's bay. He was barely conscious, his breathing wet and labored, his shirt soaked through with dark arterial blood. His left lung was collapsing with each breath, the air leak audible even without a stethoscope, a sound like wind escaping a punctured tire. Dr. Ashford moved toward him, assessed the open wound in the anterior chest wall, and froze. Not metaphorically. Physically froze. His hands hovered 6 inches from the patient's ribs, and his eyes didn't move. The resident was already calling out, BP 72/44 and dropping. O2 sat 68%. Heart rate 148. The patient's eyes were wide, the expression of a man watching his own death arrive. He was gripping at the air, at anything, his body's primal recognition that oxygen was leaving faster than it could be replaced. Danielle didn't wait for orders. She didn't look at Dr. Ashford. She moved the way apex predators moved, fluid, purposeful, without hesitation. Her hands were already pulling supplies before the thought had fully formed. One of the convoy officers had come in with the patient, a sergeant in dress blues who carried a field pack. She grabbed the pack without asking, her fingers finding exactly what she needed in less than 3 seconds, an MRE, a meal ready to eat, the tan plastic packaging from a ration that had probably been in that pack for months. She tore open the waterproof wrapper, her movements sharp and practiced. The plastic was slick, flexible, exactly what she needed. 14-gauge angiocath, now, she said to Marcus, and he had it ready before the sentence finished. She inserted the needle into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomically perfect location. The hiss of air escaping filled the bay like a sigh of relief. Then she sealed it. The MRE wrapper, pressed against the puncture wound, taped down with surgical tape. 3 layers. Enough to create a one-way valve, letting air escape but not allowing it to re-enter. The wound seal, field-tested by 75th Ranger Regiment medics and Delta Force operators in places where operating rooms didn't exist and improvisation was the difference between living and dying. The patient's breathing changed immediately. His chest wall expanded with each intake. The monitors began their gradual climb. O2 sat went from 68 to 72 to 78. His color shifted from gray-blue to something approaching human. His hand, which had been clawing at empty air, found Danielle's wrist and gripped it. She didn't flinch. She kept her other hand on his chest, monitoring respirations, feeling for the rise and fall of his lung underneath her palm. 12 minutes. That's how long she held him there, one hand on the seal, one hand on his chest, her voice steady and measured as she called out numbers to the surgical resident who was prepping him for the operating room. Respiration stabilizing at 20. Pulse oximetry 91 and holding. Keep the seal intact. He needs Reboa in OR if we can't get definitive bleeding control. The military officers had gone silent. All 4 of them. They stood at the bay entrance in their dress uniforms, watching a civilian nurse in scrubs do something they'd only seen done by medics under fire in places they couldn't talk about. One of them, a captain with silver bars, stepped forward slightly. He was staring at Danielle's hands, her concentration, the absolute absence of hesitation in every movement. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone giving testimony. "That's a field seal," he said quietly. "That's exactly a field seal." The other officer, older, rank insignia identifying him as a colonel, was still gripping consciousness with the desperation of a man holding onto a thread. His eyes focused on Danielle's face for one moment, just one, and something passed between them that had no words. Recognition. Not of her face. Of something deeper. His hand tightened on her wrist. "Are you?" he started, his voice rough, barely audible over the monitors. Danielle's head moved. A sharp, tiny shake. "Just enough." "No. Don't say it. Don't ask." The colonel's eyes registered the signal. He released her wrist, let the surgical team move him to the gurney, but as they lifted him, his other hand came up. He pressed something into her palm, warm metal, a broken chain, the weight of it heavier than its physical mass. A dog tag. She felt it before she saw it, her fingers closing around it automatically, and then the patient was gone, the gurney moving through the double doors toward surgical, the officers following in their dress uniforms. The bay went quiet except for the sound of monitors being reset and supplies being restocked. Dr. Ashford reappeared then, moving back into the space he'd vacated. His voice, when it came, carried the tone of someone reclaiming authority. "Everyone, step back. I need to assess this patient." He stopped. The bay was empty. The colonel was already gone. His eyes found Danielle, who was calmly disposing of soiled equipment into the biohazard bin. "Nurse Ross, what unauthorized procedure did you perform?" His voice was sharp, constructed to slice. "You used non-sterile materials from a bag on the floor. You performed a medical intervention without physician orders." Marcus had already left the bay, finding sudden urgent work elsewhere. It was just the two of them, Dr. Ashford and Danielle, and the smell of blood and antiseptic hanging in the air like a judgment. Danielle turned to face him. Her hands were empty now, but her fingers still held the shape of the dog tag, still felt its weight. Her eyes met his, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as surgical steel. Patient was exsanguinating. Lung was collapsing. Field seal was indicated. He's alive because of it. Each sentence was separate. Declarative. The voice of someone who had never asked permission before and had no intention of starting now. "That wasn't a medical procedure, doctor. That was triage. That was keeping him alive until surgery could fix what was broken." She turned back to her work, dismissing him with the same ease he'd learned to dismiss her. But something had shifted in the bay. The air pressure had changed. Dr. Ashford didn't move for a moment, his face working through calculations, threat assessment, exposure analysis, damage control. Then he was reaching for his phone, stepping out of the bay, already making calls. Already beginning the work of reframing what everyone had just witnessed. By 2:53 a.m., Danielle was back on geriatric, checking vitals on sleeping patients, her shift continuing the way shifts always did, continuous, indifferent to crisis, indifferent to heroism. The dog tag was in her scrub pocket, burning against her ribs like a coal. She could feel it with every breath, every movement. 2 dog tags now. Both warm. Both carrying weight that extended far beyond their physical mass. She worked through the rest of the night without speaking to anyone, without checking her phone, moving through the corridors like someone passing through a dream, there but not there, present but absent. The call came at 6:02 a.m. She was off shift by then, walking to her car in the parking garage, the dog tags clutched in her closed fist. The message was on her phone, report to administration. Immediately. No explanation. Her badge was already deactivated when she got there. Ellen Park, the administrator, was trembling. The formal letter was on her desk, already printed, already signed. Suspension pending investigation. Unauthorized medical procedures. Reckless endangerment. Lack of physician supervision. Use of non-approved materials. Exposure to litigation. The language was clinical, but the intent was annihilation. Danielle read it once, then set it on the desk without comment. Security escorted her to her locker. Her hands emptied it into a cardboard box, personal items, a change of clothes, the photo of a unit she couldn't talk about, a medal she couldn't explain. 12 years. Everything she'd carried with her into this hospital, they loaded into a box the size of a cereal container. She didn't fight. There was no point in fighting. She'd learned that in Kandahar, in a hospital where arguing with orders got people killed. You took the hit. You survived. You waited. The parking garage was empty at this hour, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of surrender. She sat in her car with the door open, the cardboard box on the passenger seat, the 2 dog tags in her closed fist. The engine was dead. The keys were in her lap. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and didn't move. Outside, rain was falling, hammering the concrete like applause or like accusation, and she sat in perfect stillness, holding the weight of 2 dog tags, the same amount of time she'd held a stranger's chest together. 40 minutes. She could wait longer than that. She could wait forever. Rain against the windshield. The hum of the garage lights. And somewhere in her closed fist, metal warm and real and true, the proof that some things couldn't be erased by bureaucracy, even when everyone was trying. 2 years. That's how long Colonel James Mitchell searched. He'd survived IED blasts that took limbs from men standing 3 feet away. Survived firefights in valleys where the mountains themselves seemed to be firing at you. Survived 40 minutes with his chest cavity held together by hands that moved like they'd rehearsed the choreography of staying alive 1,000 times before. But he couldn't survive not knowing her name. The inquiry came through official channels, Colonel Mitchell requesting medical records from the trauma admission on the night of the convoy accident. Routine paperwork, or so it seemed. A background check flagged the name Danielle Ross against a database most civilians didn't know existed. Classified security clearance. Active reserve status. Medical discharge, honorable. The flags triggered alerts that climbed chains of command the hospital administration didn't even know existed. By 9 a.m., Ellen Park, Seattle General's chief administrator, was sitting in her office staring at a file marked restricted with a phone number that had a 703 area code. The voice on the other end belonged to a colonel who wanted to know why a major with combat medical credentials was working as a bedside nurse in a civilian hospital while under disciplinary suspension. Ellen's hands trembled as she opened Danielle's personnel file. 23 years old at enlistment. Combat medic, 75th Ranger Regiment Attachment. Kandahar. 2 Purple Hearts. A discharge summary that said only service-connected injury, medical retirement approved with every detail redacted in thick black lines. She read the suspension notice posted by Dr. Ashford. Unauthorized medical procedure. Scope violation. Patient endangerment. The trembling got worse. Night shift in geriatric care, that's where Danielle was when Captain Sarah Mitchell found her restocking supplies in room for 12. The captain wore her dress uniform despite the hour, blues that caught the fluorescent light like a flag. She was younger than Danielle by maybe 4 years, with eyes that had the same predatory focus as her father's. Major Ross, Captain Mitchell said. Not a question. Danielle turned slowly. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. But something in her jaw tightened, the smallest clench that Captain Mitchell caught immediately. My father has been looking for you, the captain continued. For 2 years. The supply cart's wheels squeaked against the tile. That's what Danielle heard first, that high, plastic squeak, before she processed the words. Before she understood that the military had finally connected the threads back to Seattle General. Back to her. Back to the dog tag still warm in the pocket of her scrubs. Ellen Park intercepted her before shift change. Walked directly into the break room where Danielle sat in the corner, eating soup she didn't taste, and gestured toward her office without words. The hospital administrator's voice cracked when she began reading from the file. Bronze Star with Valor. The words caught. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Danielle's spoon didn't waver. The broth rippled slightly, a small concentric circle spreading from the center like a dropped stone in water. Kandahar, Ellen whispered. 40 minutes. Major, why didn't you tell anyone? No one asked, Danielle said quietly. The board meeting happened at 10 p.m. that same night. Conference room on the 3rd floor. Colonel James Mitchell stood at the head of the table flanked by 2 Delta Force operators in civilian clothes, which somehow made them look more dangerous, the restraint of it, the refusal to advertise what they were. Danielle remained standing as well, Ellen Park beside her. The colonel's voice was steady. Measured. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer and being thoroughly unimpressed by the rest of it. Bronze Star with Valor, he said. Each medal its own sentence. Its own beat. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. The board members had stopped breathing. Major Ross held my chest cavity closed with her bare hands for 40 minutes under enemy fire in Kandahar, Colonel Mitchell continued. The round that took me down went straight through the anterior chest wall. Tension pneumothorax. Hemorrhagic shock. 3 of my team members were pinned down, returning fire. She didn't have equipment. She didn't have an operating room. She had an MRE wrapper and hands that didn't shake. He paused. Let the silence land like an artillery round. She's the reason 12 men came home, he finished. She's the reason I'm standing here. Dr. Ashford began to speak. His mouth opened. Words attempted formation. There are protocols. She violated hospital policy regardless of her background. His voice had lost the edge it once carried. The confidence was gone, replaced by something thin and panicked. Chain of command exists for patient safety, and I don't care what happened overseas, this is a civilian hospital. You froze, one of the Delta Force operators said. His voice was the kind of quiet that comes from understanding physics and trajectory and how little effort it takes to end something. The convoy members gave statements, he continued. You froze while a patient was dying. Rebecca Chen stood abruptly, gathering her papers. Her movements were sharp, decisive. Ellen, I need to see all documentation on this suspension immediately. She looked at Danielle. Looked at her the way someone looks when they've just realized they've been on the wrong side of a line. My apologies, Major. We failed you. Phone calls came next. Board members texting into encrypted chats. The room humming with the invisible electricity of power shifting in real time. Dr. Ashford's carefully constructed authority wasn't collapsing slowly. It was imploding. Sinkhole fast. He made his critical error in the small hours of the morning, sitting in his office with the door locked, staring at the security footage from the trauma bay. The video that showed everything. Him frozen. His hands hovering uselessly. Danielle moving with precision that belonged in an operating room, belonged in a combat zone, belonged everywhere he didn't. He deleted the files. Timestamp 2:34 a.m. Accessed the server, entered his credentials, initiated a purge of 40 minutes of HD footage. What Dr. Ashford didn't know was that Marcus Webb, the hospital's IT specialist, wore a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm and monitored the network from a basement office where he'd learned to watch for exactly this kind of move. Marcus had seen deletion attempts before. He'd learned what panic looked like when transmitted across fiber optics. He saved every frame to an encrypted drive and walked directly to Ellen Park's office. His uniform was casual, jeans, baseball cap, but something about his posture said he'd worn dress blues once and would wear them again. He said. Dr. Ashford just tried to delete security footage from the night of the convoy accident. I have the access logs with timestamps. I have everything. The footage was played at an emergency board meeting 12 hours later. The silence in that conference room was the kind you could operate in. Clean. Sterile. Absolute. On screen, Dr. Ashford frozen, eyes wide, calculating nothing, helping no one. His hands hovering at his sides like they belonged to someone else's body. Then Danielle moving into the frame. Her movements economical. Her mind running tactical. O2 climbing on the monitor in real time. 12 minutes. Then 16. Then the patient stabilizing while Ashford remained parallel parked outside the moment. The timeline was undeniable. Undeniable and damning. By morning, Dr. Ashford sat in Ellen Park's office while hospital attorneys in dark suits outlined his termination. Destruction of evidence. Falsification of performance reports. Abuse of authority. Patient endangerment. His medical license would be flagged for review. The state board would have questions. Security escorted him from the building with the same methodical efficiency they'd used on Danielle 2 months prior. He protested. Threatened lawsuits. Dropped names of allies and board connections. Nobody answered his calls. Rebecca Chen had already resigned from the board rather than be associated with him. His emergency meetings were cancelled. His support network evaporated like morning fog under hospital lights. 6 months later, Danielle walked through the same hallway where she'd once restocked supplies in the dark hours of her exile. She wore the new title with the ease of someone who'd always held authority, just took the institution a while to notice. Director of Trauma Services. The position had been created specifically for her. Ellen Park's formal apology had included not just words but institutional change. Protocols revised. Staff retraining mandated. A salary that reflected her military rank equivalent and then some. Nurses now stopped her to ask questions. Residents requested her mentorship. The break room fell silent with respect when she entered, not shame. On a Tuesday afternoon, she walked to her old locker to retrieve a forgotten book. The hallway near the service entrance was quieter, off the main trauma corridor. She saw him almost before she registered what she was seeing. Dr. Ashford, wearing a security guard uniform for the night shift. Radio clipped to his belt. Flashlight in his hand. Checking badges at a service entrance like a man who'd been demoted not just from his position but from his entire understanding of who he was. Their eyes met for one long moment. He opened his mouth as if to speak. Something flickered across his face, recognition, shame, the terrible awareness of a man who'd underestimated the wrong person and paid for it in ways that would follow him into every future. He turned away without speaking. There was nothing left to say. Danielle didn't move. Didn't blink. Just watched him fade into the fluorescent shadows where he belonged. The following Sunday, Danielle stood beside Colonel James Mitchell at the Raleigh Veterans Memorial, both in dress uniform. Her bronze star gleamed on her chest. Her purple heart caught the afternoon light. Behind them, Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention, and Marcus Webb, the IT specialist, wore his Marine Corps dress blues. A small gathering of Delta Force operators in civilian clothes formed a quiet perimeter, and Ellen Park watched from the gathered crowd. Colonel Mitchell held the broken dog tag chain she'd carried for 2 years. The metal was warm from his hand. "I've been trying to get this back to you," he said quietly, "for longer than I can measure." Danielle didn't speak. Her hands remained steady as his hands closed the broken chain around her neck. 2 dog tags now. Hers and his. Reunited where they belonged. Her hand rose in salute, controlled, precise, the gesture of someone who'd spent her entire life holding things together in the dark. The officers returned the salute in unison. The sound of it was like distant thunder rolling across the memorial, and Danielle didn't think about Dr. Ashford in his security guard uniform, didn't think about the exile or the suspension or the months of doubt. She thought about 40 minutes in Kandahar. She thought about hands that didn't shake. She thought about 12 men coming home. When she returned to Seattle General the following Monday, the trauma bay felt different. New protocols on every wall. Staff trained and retrained and understanding. She led a critical trauma case through a 9-hour reconstruction, her voice calm and commanding, the dog tags visible at her collar catching the surgical lights. The outcome was positive. The patient survived. The team moved like people who trusted their leader not because of a title but because of what the title represented. That's when people finally understood. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven yourself right, subscribe for more videos like this. Like and comment below. Tell me, have you ever worked for someone like Dr. Ashford, and did you ever get your moment of vindication?